The principles within these pages were drawn from the life of a man who built and lost fortunes, and built them again. They are presented here in expanded form, with commentary and illustration, to bring Barnum's hard-won wisdom into the hands and ears of a modern listener. The ideas are his, the voice is his, the urgency is timeless. Picture the scene. It is a cold January night in New York City, 1865. The streets outside Barnum's American Museum are packed so tightly with people that mounted police have been called to manage the crowd. Inside, thousands jostle shoulder to shoulder to gawk at curiosities, freaks, wonders, and spectacles assembled from the farthest corners of the earth. Bearded women, living skeletons, giants and dwarves, a white whale swimming in a tank, Tom Thumb, the most famous little man alive, greeting dignitaries with the polished confidence of a statesman. At the center of all this magnificent chaos stands one man, Phineas Taylor Barnum, the self-proclaimed Prince of Humbugs, the greatest showman who ever lived. But here is the thing that history tends to forget. Barnum was not merely a showman. He was a financial mind of extraordinary depth, a man who understood the relationship between value, perception, reputation, and money better than almost any businessman of his era. He had made fortunes and lost them. He had declared bankruptcy and rebuilt from nothing, not once, but multiple times. He had negotiated contracts with presidents, entertained queens, and employed thousands. He understood, in ways that most men never would, what it took to generate wealth, hold on to it, and make it grow. And in 1880, at the age of 70, Barnum sat down to write it all out. The result was The Art of Money Getting, a slim, direct, fiercely practical guide to financial success. 20 principles, no fluff, no apologies, just the hard-learned wisdom of a man who had stood at the top of the world, seen it collapse beneath his feet, and climbed back up again with his boots on. What you are about to hear is that wisdom, expanded, illustrated, and arranged for the modern listener who wants not just to make money, but to understand it. Barnum believed that anyone could prosper, not everyone born wealthy, not the well-connected or the already privileged, anyone. He had seen too many self-made men and too many squandered inheritances to believe otherwise. What separated those who prospered from those who failed, he argued, was not intelligence, not luck, and not even hard work alone. It was principle. It was character built on specific, learnable habits of mind and action. This is the book he wrote for those who wanted to learn those habits. It begins with the most important question a person can ask themselves. And it is not, how do I make money? It is something far more fundamental than that. It is, am I doing the right thing? Chapter 1. Don't mistake your vocation. There is a kind of suffering that fills no hospitals and appears in no obituaries. The quiet misery of a man or woman doing the wrong work. You have seen it. Perhaps you have lived it. The lawyer who should have been a painter, the accountant who burns with the soul of a poet, the soldier who would have thrived as a farmer. These people are not failures in any conventional sense. Many of them work hard, show up on time, and perform their duties adequately. But adequately is not the same as excellently, and they know it. There is a ceiling above them that no amount of effort seems to break, because the ceiling is not made of circumstance. It is made of misfit. Barnum was unsparing on this point. More men fail from not being suited to their vocation than for any other reason. This is a radical claim, and it deserves to be taken seriously. We live in a culture that celebrates grinding, the idea that any person, through sheer force of will and enough sleepless nights, can excel at anything. Barnum did not believe this. He believed, and his long life as both employer and entrepreneur confirmed it, that every human being is born with certain natural aptitudes that no amount of training can fully manufacture. A man who is constitutionally impatient should not be a doctor. A woman who is deeply introverted and finds crowds draining should not open a restaurant. A person who has no feel for numbers should not manage accounts. This is not defeatism. This is wisdom. The opposite error is equally common. Choosing a vocation not for fit, but for prestige. How many young men and women have entered law or medicine not because they loved the work, but because their parents expected it, or because the title sounded impressive, or because the salary seemed secure. These are poor reasons for spending the next 40 years of your life. And the cost is not merely personal misery. The cost is financial, because a person who is mismatched to their work rarely reaches the upper levels of that field. And the upper levels are where the real money lives. So how does one find the right vocation? Barnum's answer was characteristically direct. Look inward before you look outward. What do you find yourself doing when no one is watching, when there is no reward? What subjects make time disappear? What problems do you solve with energy that other people find exhausting? These are clues, not guarantees. Clues. But they are more reliable clues than salary charts or social expectations. And once you find the right fit, give yourself to it entirely. Barnum told the story of a young man who came to him seeking advice. He was drifting between trades, had tried 4 or 5 occupations, succeeded at none. He was intelligent, well-mannered, and clearly capable. But he kept abandoning each new enterprise the moment it became difficult, searching for something that would feel easier. Barnum told him plainly, no honest work feels easy in the beginning. Difficulty is not a sign of wrong fit. The sign of right fit is that the difficulty interests you rather than repels you, that you want to understand the problem, not escape it. There is also the question of calling versus vocation, and they are not always the same thing. A man may be called to serve his community without being suited to politics. A woman may be called to heal others without being suited to surgery. Barnum had no quarrel with calling. He respected it deeply, but he understood that a calling pursued through the wrong vehicle is a wheel spinning in mud, moral energy without practical traction. The first step toward wealth, then, is honest self-examination, not the comfortable kind, the kind that confirms what we already want to believe about ourselves, the uncomfortable kind that asks, in this work I am doing, do I have an actual gift, or am I here by default, by accident, by expectation? Answer honestly, then act on the answer. The rest of Barnum's principles build from this foundation, and they build beautifully. But if this foundation is wrong, no amount of frugality, perseverance, or advertising will save you. Chapter 2. Select the right location. Use the right tools. A gifted surgeon operating with a broken scalpel is still a gifted surgeon, but he is not performing at his best. And a mediocre surgeon with the finest instruments in the world is still a mediocre surgeon. The tools do not make the man, but the right tools in the hands of the right man, operating in the right environment, that combination produces results that astonish the world. Barnum understood environment the way a general understands terrain. You do not choose a battlefield. The battlefield chooses you. But a wise general knows how to read the ground and use it to his advantage. Location was one of Barnum's obsessions. He understood that the same talent, the same business idea, the same level of energy could produce wildly different outcomes depending on where it was deployed. A tailor who sets up shop in a small town with no wealthy clientele will work just as hard as a tailor on a fashionable city street and earn a fraction as much. This is not failure. It is geography. When choosing where to build a business or pursue a career, Barnum counseled careful study of the environment. Who lives here? What do they need? What can they afford? Is there competition? And if so, what does that competition reveal about the market's appetite? A crowded market is not always a bad sign. It can be evidence of strong demand. But it requires differentiation, a reason for customers to choose you over an established competitor. And that reason must be real, not merely advertised. He was equally direct about tools, not in the narrow mechanical sense, but in the broadest possible understanding of the word. A carpenter's tools are his saws and planes. A writer's tools are her vocabulary, her reading, her understanding of structure and rhythm. A merchant's tools are his accounting systems, his supplier relationships, his knowledge of what his customers want before they know it themselves. Whatever your vocation, use the best tools you can afford. This was not an invitation to extravagance. Barnum was sharply critical of unnecessary spending. But there is a category of spending that is not expense. It is investment. The carpenter who buys cheap tools because they are cheap will spend twice the money replacing them and do worse work in the meantime. The merchant who neglects good bookkeeping because it feels expensive will lose more in uncaught errors than any accountant's fees would have cost. The principle, then, is this: distinguish clearly between the expense that drains and the investment that multiplies. On expenses, be ruthless. On investments that make your primary skill more powerful, be generous. There is a deeper wisdom here, too. Barnum believed that the right location and the right tools were not merely practical concerns. They were expressions of seriousness. A person who works in a clean, well-organized space with quality instruments is sending a message to themselves as much as to the world. I take this work seriously. I am not here by accident. I have prepared. That psychological posture, that declared seriousness, changes how a person works. It raises the standard they hold themselves to. And in business, as in war, the person who holds themselves to the highest standard usually wins. Audiobooks 3. The virtue of economy. Here is something that confuses many people about wealth. The primary way to become wealthy is not to earn more money. It is to spend less than you earn. This sounds obvious. It sounds almost insultingly simple. And yet the failure to live by it has undone more promising financial lives than any recession, any bad investment, or any unkind twist of fate. The failure to live by it is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of desire management, and Barnum had seen it destroy fortunes at every level. The young tradesman who buys a fine coat when a plain one will do, and the rich merchant who builds a mansion when a comfortable house would serve. Economy does not mean stinginess. Barnum was emphatic on this point, and is worth pausing here because the confusion between the two ideas has made many people miserable, and none of them wealthy. A miser hoards. He denies himself and his family reasonable comfort in the pursuit of numbers in a ledger. He loses friends, opportunities, and joy in the service of an abstraction. He dies clutching his savings and leaves behind a life of gray refusal. That is not what Barnum had in mind. Economy, as Barnum understood it, is the intelligent alignment of spending with purpose. It means spending generously on what matters: the tools that build your craft, the food that sustains your health, the education of your children, the investments that create future income, and refusing to spend on what does not matter: the fashionable hat that impresses people whose opinion is irrelevant, the expensive wine ordered to avoid looking cheap at a table full of strangers, the larger house rented to signal success that has not yet arrived. These are the expenses that quietly hollow out fortunes. Not one by one. Each individual purchase seems small, but together, over years, they represent tens of thousands of dollars that could have been saved, invested, compounded. Barnum introduced a concept that sounds almost radical in its simplicity: always live within your income. He was not speaking of merely surviving on what you earn. He was speaking of habitually and consistently spending less, of treating the gap between income and expense not as leftover, but as purpose, the seed money for future growth. He told the story of a young couple, newly married, who begin their life together in a modest apartment. Their friends live in larger places. They feel the pressure to keep up. They rent a bigger apartment than they need. They buy furniture to match it. Then a carriage, because people of their station have carriages. Then clothes to match the carriage. Then a servant. Each step seems reasonable in isolation. Together, these steps build a structure of expense that requires a constantly growing income simply to sustain, not to grow, not to save, merely to maintain the current level. This is the trap that Barnum called living for the appearance of wealth rather than the reality of it. It is a trap so elegant, so socially enforced, that millions of people walk into it with their eyes wide open, convinced at every step that they are simply doing what sensible people do. The alternative requires a kind of courage that is quiet rather than dramatic, the courage to care less about appearances than about actual financial health, to live in the smaller house without apology, to drive the older car, to say, "I cannot afford that," without shame, because the person who says those words with honesty is building something real, while the person who cannot bring themselves to say them is building a beautiful facade over a crumbling foundation. Compound interest, Barnum noted, works as powerfully in reverse as it does in your favor. Money saved and invested grows. Money spent on things that depreciate the moment you touch them, clothes, carriages, entertainments, status symbols, does not merely disappear. It takes with it all the future growth it might have generated. The true cost of an unnecessary expense is not its price tag. It is its price tag multiplied by what that money would have become. Economy, then, is not a sacrifice. It is a long-term investment in freedom. Chapter 4. Avoid debt like a contagion. In the summer of 1856, P.T. Barnum, one of the most famous men in America, was broke, not merely short of cash, bankrupt. His creditors were at the door, his properties were encumbered. His name, which had been a gold mine, was temporarily a liability. The magnificent life he had built had collapsed under the weight of something he had failed to control: debt. The cause was not recklessness in his primary business. It was a side investment, a clock-making company that he had signed for in trust, backing a friend's enterprise with his personal credit. The company failed. The debt was his. And because he had allowed his financial life to become entangled with borrowed money in ways he had not fully understood, The collapse of one investment dragged down the edifice of everything else. He rebuilt. Of course, he rebuilt. This was Barnum. But the rebuilding took years of humiliation, of lecturing tours that were really debt repayment tours, of carefully reconstructing trust with partners, with banks, with the public. And from that crucible emerged one of the most passionate convictions of his financial philosophy: avoid debt. Not merely excessive debt, not merely reckless debt. Debt. Wherever possible, in whatever form, avoid it. Young men starting in life should avoid running into debt, he wrote, with the emphasis of a man who knew precisely what he was talking about. There is scarcely anything that drags a person down like debt. The arithmetic of debt is deeply unfriendly. When you borrow money, you pay interest, which means you are paying for the privilege of having money today instead of later. Every dollar of interest is a dollar of income that goes to a creditor rather than to your future, and debt has a way of compounding its demands. A debt that was manageable in good times becomes crushing when income falls. A debt that was temporary becomes permanent when it is rolled over. A debt that seemed local spreads, as Barnum's did, to infect everything it touches. Beyond the arithmetic, there is the psychology of debt, and Barnum was as attuned to psychology as any man of his era. A person who is in debt is not free. They are making decisions not on the basis of what is right or strategic or aligned with their values, but on the basis of what the creditor needs. They cannot walk away from a bad situation. They cannot take a risk that might temporarily reduce their income. They are, in the most practical sense, working for someone else's interest even while believing they are working for their own. This is not freedom. This is bondage with good furniture. Barnum was not naive about the world. He understood that certain debts, carefully chosen, well-structured, could be tools for growth. A businessman who borrows to buy equipment that generates more income than the debt costs is using debt wisely. A family that takes a mortgage on a home they could not otherwise afford may be making a reasonable exchange. Barnum was not preaching a primitive anti-debt absolutism, but he was issuing a warning that the modern world has made more relevant, not less. Debt is attractive precisely because it lets you consume your future today. And consuming your future today is exactly what the wealthy do not do. The wealthy build their futures. They do not spend them before they arrive. The discipline of paying as you go, of buying only what you can afford with money you already have, builds something that no credit line can provide. The habit of deferred gratification. And that habit, more than any single investment or lucky break, is the engine of compounded wealth. Pay as you go. Sleep soundly. Build slowly. It is less exciting than the alternatives. It is also the path that Barnum, having tried the others, ultimately endorsed with everything he had. Chapter 5. Persevere. The one quality that defeats all obstacles. The word perseverance has become something of a cliché in the literature of success. Rolled out in motivational speeches, embroidered on throw pillows, tattooed on the wrists of the easily discouraged. It has been repeated so many times in so many contexts that it has nearly lost its meaning. Barnum had no patience for clichés. He meant something very specific when he talked about perseverance, and it was grounded in hard observation rather than wishful thinking. He had watched men with extraordinary talent fail simply because they stopped. They built something real, encountered a serious obstacle, and, not knowing what else to do, walked away. They were not stupid. They were not lazy. They were simply unequipped for the specific experience of continuing to move forward when forward is not immediately visible. He had also watched men of middling talent, no great intelligence, and no particular charm succeed spectacularly, simply because they refused to quit, not because they were stubborn or unimaginative, because they understood at a bone-deep level that the path between intention and achievement passes through a long, dark middle, and the only way out of the middle is through it. This is what Barnum called perseverance, not the blind repetition of failed approaches, but the sustained commitment to a goal through setbacks, pivots, dry spells, doubts, and the perfectly reasonable-sounding suggestions of well-meaning friends that it might be time to try something else. The timing of failure is important to understand. In Barnum's observation, most businesses, most ventures of any kind, face their most serious crisis not at the beginning, when the founder is energized by novelty and operating on adrenaline, but in the middle, when the first rush of enthusiasm has passed. Results are slower than hoped, and the gap between current reality and original vision is still wide. This is the valley where most people stop, and this is also, Barnum argued, where almost every successful enterprise eventually passed through. The difference between the business that became great and the business that became a cautionary tale was often nothing more than whether the founder crossed that valley or turned back. He illustrated this with a story, the kind he told with the timing of a born performer. A man digs for gold. He digs for months. He finds nothing. His money runs out. His equipment is worn. His friends tell him the gold is not there. He sells his claim for a small sum and walks away. The man who buys the claim from him for almost nothing resumes digging at exactly the spot where the first man stopped. 3 feet further down, he finds one of the richest veins of gold in the region. 3 feet. That was the entire cost of quitting. Now, Barnum was not suggesting that every abandoned effort should have been continued. Sometimes the gold really is not there. Sometimes the business model is wrong, the market has changed, or the founder has genuinely mistaken their vocation. And in those cases, stopping and redirecting is wisdom, not weakness. Barnum had pivoted himself many times and never apologized for it. The test, he argued, is this: are you considering stopping because the work itself has taught you that it is the wrong direction? Or are you considering stopping because the work has become hard, discouraging, and unrewarding in the short term? The first reason is intelligence. The second reason is ordinary human impatience. And it has killed more fortunes than any recession in history. Cultivate the habit of following through, not just on the large, dramatic commitments, but on the small ones. The person who finishes what they start, consistently, reliably, even when no one is watching, develops a reputation that opens doors, and they develop something more valuable than reputation, an internal certainty that they are capable of completing hard things. That certainty, once earned, cannot be taken away. Chapter 6. Whatever you do, do it with all your might. A half-hearted farmer grows half a harvest. A half-hearted surgeon performs half an operation, which is, of course, no operation at all. A half-hearted teacher half teaches, which means the students half learn, which means the knowledge half takes root, which means the whole enterprise was a kind of organized waste of time. Barnum's sixth principle is in some ways the most obvious thing he ever wrote. And yet, watching the way most people approach their work, it reads like a revelation. Most people give most of their energy to most of their work. That is to say, they hold something back, not deliberately, not out of malice or laziness, but out of self-protection. The unconscious decision not to invest fully in something that might fail, might be rejected, might not be appreciated. If you do not give everything, you cannot be fully hurt when it does not work. This is the psychology of the half-hearted effort, and it is extraordinarily common. What it produces is a life of near misses and almost theirs. Work that is technically competent but not excellent. A reputation that is respectable but not remarkable. An income that is adequate but not generous. Barnum's prescription was simple and total. Whatever you do, do it with all your might, not with all your remaining energy after you have subtracted the portion held in reserve. All of it. The kind of effort that is recognizable to others not because it is loud or theatrical. It need not be either, but because the quality of the result speaks for itself. He pointed to the difference between two men in the same trade, working the same hours, serving the same market. One does adequate work. The other does work that astonishes. The difference in outcome, over 10 years, is not proportional to the difference in effort. It is exponential, because the man who does excellent work builds a reputation that generates new business without his having to seek it. The adequate man must constantly pursue customers. The excellent man must manage the customers pursuing him. Full commitment changes the nature of the work itself. When you decide, truly decide, not merely intend, to do something as well as it can possibly be done, your mind begins to see it differently. Problems that were invisible at lower levels of engagement become apparent. Solutions that required the kind of concentrated attention you only get from full engagement begin to emerge. The excellent craftsman does not merely do more of the same thing as the adequate one. He does a fundamentally different kind of thing. There is also a moral dimension to this principle that Barnum clearly felt, though he expressed it in the pragmatic language of a businessman rather than the elevated language of a preacher. When a person accepts money in exchange for work, they have entered into a contract, implicit but binding, to deliver the best work they are capable of delivering. Anything less is a kind of small theft, not of money exactly, but of potential, of what the customer was rightfully owed. This may sound severe, but consider the alternative. A world in which every person delivers the minimum required to satisfy the letter of their agreement, while holding their real capability in reserve. That is, in fact, the world that most institutions produce. And it is precisely why, in any field, the person who delivers genuine excellence stands out so completely. Do the work entirely. Hold nothing back. See what happens to your reputation, your income, and your own experience of the work itself. Barnum's wager, and it was a wager he made with his whole life, was that full effort pays dividends that half effort cannot even imagine. Chapter 7. Self-reliance and personal exertion. There is a certain type of person who is always waiting for the right partner to come along and provide the missing piece, waiting for the economy to improve so conditions will be more favorable, waiting for a lucky break, a chance meeting, an unexpected inheritance, a turn of fortune that will make the hard work unnecessary, waiting for someone to recognize their talent and offer them the opportunity they deserve. This person is, in Barnum's view, making a fundamental error about how wealth is actually built. Barnum was not a man who denied the role of luck in financial life. He had benefited from fortunate timing, from the right person appearing at the right moment, from the general prosperity of an expanding America that gave ambition room to run. He acknowledged these things. He was not naive, but he had also watched too many talented people leverage luck into nothing because they had cultivated the habit of depending on external forces rather than internal ones. When luck arrived, they did not know what to do with it. When luck withdrew, they had no reserve of self-generated momentum to fall back on. "Depend upon your own personal exertions," Barnum wrote. Not instead of luck, not in denial of the help that others can provide, but as the irreducible foundation beneath everything else. The engine that runs whether or not the wind is favorable. Self-reliance, as Barnum understood it, is not rugged individualism for its own sake. It is not the refusal to accept help or learn from others. Barnum hired excellent people, sought wise counsel, and freely admitted what he did not know. Self-reliance is something more specific. The refusal to allow your financial destiny to rest primarily in someone else's hands. The person who says, truthfully, "I can build something valuable with my own skill and effort," has power that the person waiting for favorable conditions will never have. Because conditions are always either favorable or unfavorable, but internal capability, once cultivated, is constant. It goes where you go. It survives market collapses and bad luck and the departure of partners. It cannot be taken away. Building that internal capability requires a specific discipline, the consistent, daily practice of doing the actual work, making the actual decisions, facing the actual consequences. Not outsourcing judgment to others out of convenience or fear, not waiting for someone wiser to show you the way, reading, learning, asking good questions. Yes, but then doing, with your own hands, your own mind, your own creative problem-solving. Barnum noted that the habit of self-reliance must be cultivated early because it is much harder to build after years of dependency than it is to develop from the start. The young person who, at 25, makes a habit of handling their own affairs, who pays their own bills, makes their own investments, solves their own problems, is building a kind of financial musculature that will serve them for the next 50 years. The person who defers everything to others is building nothing, and when the support is eventually removed, as it always eventually is, they find themselves without the strength to stand alone. This is not a comfortable message. It asks something real of us. But Barnum, who had stood alone in the rubble of his own collapsed fortune and rebuilt it with his own hands, was qualified to deliver it. And he delivered it not with cruelty, but with something more useful, the absolute confidence that it could be done. Chapter 8. Be systematic, the power of order. Barnum admired genius. He employed geniuses, promoted geniuses, made fortunes from the talents of genuinely extraordinary people. But he held a private conviction, born of long experience, that he rarely advertised in public. Systematic mediocrity beats chaotic brilliance, almost every time. Not always. The truly exceptional talent, the performer who redefines their field, the inventor who makes an industry, can operate in chaos and still produce results that leave system-minded people speechless. But these people are very rare, and they are often terrible at the business of their own lives, even when they are transforming the world with their work. For the other 99%, for the rest of us, system is the multiplier that turns ordinary capability into exceptional results. What Barnum meant by system was not rigidity. He was not advocating for the kind of bureaucratic proceduralism that smothers innovation and produces the mediocrity of the committee. He meant something simpler and more powerful, doing things in a consistent, intelligent order, with each element of your work supporting every other element. The systematic person arrives at their work knowing what they are going to do first, second, and third. They complete tasks before moving to new ones, rather than leaving a trail of half-finished efforts behind them. They track their income and expenses not because they distrust themselves, but because the numbers reveal patterns that memory never will. They allocate specific time to specific types of work, so that the urgent does not perpetually cannibalize the important. Barnum contrasted this with the genius of disorder, the person who trusts their brilliance to carry them through, who works in inspired bursts and fallow stretches, who produces extraordinary things occasionally, and nothing the rest of the time. This person is often more talented than the systematic plotter, but the systematic plotter wins, not because the world is unfair, but because reliability compounds. The person who produces good work consistently, every day, every week, every year, over a 20-year period, creates an astonishing total. Far more than the person whose output comes in brilliant but erratic waves. This principle applies to money management with particular force. The person who systematically spends less than they earn, who does this not occasionally, not when they remember, not when the month goes well, but always as a matter of settled habit, builds wealth that the high earner without system will never accumulate. The amounts need not be large. The system need only be consistent. Time and consistency do the rest. Set your systems. Review them periodically. Improve them when experience reveals a better way, and then maintain them with the same steady commitment that a good farmer gives to his land. Not because every day is dramatic or rewarding, but because the long-term result is worth the quiet daily discipline. Chapter 9. Integrity, Advertising, and the Building of Reputations. Barnum was the greatest self-promoter of his century. He understood advertising the way a composer understands music, as a language with its own grammar, its own rhythms, its own power to move people. He advertised everything, constantly, relentlessly, with an exuberance that his competitors found baffling and his audiences found irresistible. But here is something that his reputation as the Prince of Humbugs tends to obscure. Barnum's philosophy of business at its foundation was built on a principle of radical honesty, not because he was a saint, because he was a businessman. And he had learned, through decades of experience, that honesty was simply the most durable competitive advantage in existence. Consider the arithmetic. A dishonest merchant may cheat a customer once. He gains something in the short term, a slightly larger profit on that transaction, but he loses the customer's trust, and with it, all the future business that customer might have provided. More dangerously, he loses the customer's goodwill, which in the pre-internet era was spread by word of mouth, and in the digital era is spread at viral speed. The long-term cost of a single act of dishonesty, fully accounted for, is almost always larger than the short-term gain. Barnum had watched this calculation play out hundreds of times, and he had watched the opposite as well. The merchant who lost money on a transaction to make it right with a customer, and who was repaid with a loyalty that lasted decades and generated referrals worth 10 times what he had sacrificed. Honesty, he argued, is not merely a moral virtue. It is an investment strategy. On the subject of advertising, Barnum was equally clear. Though his message is more nuanced than his reputation suggests, he was not advocating for hype, for exaggeration, for the manufacture of false impressions. He was advocating for the active, enthusiastic, creative communication of genuine value. There is an enormous difference between those two things. And most people fail not because they oversell, but because they undersell. They build something genuinely excellent and then mention it quietly, modestly, as if drawing attention to their own work were somehow impolite. The result is that excellent work goes unknown, while mediocre work, more loudly promoted, captures the market. Barnum thought this was a kind of cowardice dressed as humility. If you have made something valuable, something that would genuinely improve the lives of the people you are trying to reach, you have an obligation to make sure they know about it, not through deception, not through manipulation, but through vigorous, creative, persistent communication. Let the world know what you do. Let it know well. Let it know often. The combination of genuine quality and vigorous promotion is, in Barnum's framework, nearly unstoppable. Quality without promotion is hidden treasure. Promotion without quality is a flame that burns bright and dies fast. But the two together, that is the engine of lasting commercial success. Build your reputation the way you build a cathedral, slowly, on a deep foundation, with attention to every detail, knowing that it must stand long after you are gone, and then make sure the cathedral is visible. Chapter 10. Health, Character, and the Foundation. Beneath all wealth. We have arrived, at last, at the place Barnum considered most fundamental. Not tactics, not techniques, not even principles of investment or advertising, but the irreducible foundation on which every other principle in this book must rest. Sound health. Honest character. Without the first, the energy required to build wealth is simply not available. Without the second, the wealth that is built will not hold. And more importantly, the person holding it will not hold themselves. Barnum's views on health were ahead of his time in their simplicity. He was writing in an era when patent medicines were mainstream and the understanding of diet, exercise, and rest was primitive by modern standards. And yet what he advocated sounds almost like a contemporary wellness protocol. Moderate, regular physical activity, sufficient sleep, taken seriously as a pillar of function rather than a concession to weakness. Sobriety, not out of puritanical principle, but out of the practical observation that alcohol destroys the mental clarity, physical energy, and social reputation that wealth building requires. Moderation in all physical appetites, not deprivation, but discipline. His argument was straightforwardly economic. A healthy man at 50 is worth more than a sick man at 30. The body is the instrument through which all other instruments are played. Neglect it, and the music stops, no matter how fine the violin. The principle of honest character runs deeper. Barnum had known rich men of dishonest character, men who had accumulated significant wealth through methods he would not have employed. Some of them kept their wealth for a time. None of them, in his observation, built anything that lasted beyond their own lifetimes. The dishonest fortune is built on a foundation of borrowed trust. And borrowed trust, like borrowed money, must eventually be repaid. When the repayment comes, it is rarely convenient. But character is not merely a strategy. This is where Barnum, the businessman, gave way to Barnum, the man. He believed, not as a calculating proposition, but as a genuine conviction, that a life of honest dealing, of keeping one's word, of treating customers and employees and partners with fairness, was intrinsically better than the alternative. Not more profitable, better, more aligned with the actual purpose of a human life. What is money for? This was a question Barnum returned to repeatedly, not in so many words. He was too practical for abstract philosophizing, but in the shape of his choices. He gave away enormous sums to charitable causes. He built a circus that genuinely delighted millions of people who could afford no other entertainment. He created employment for hundreds of families. He used his wealth, in other words, not merely to accumulate more wealth, but to produce something for the world beyond himself. This is the final and most important principle in the art of money getting. And it is the one most easily overlooked because it is the least immediately practical. But Barnum knew, and life confirms, that the people who build lasting wealth are almost never the ones who want money purely for what it buys. They are the ones who want it for what it enables: independence, security, generosity, the ability to pursue their work without the grinding anxiety of financial fragility, the capacity to take care of people they love and causes they believe in. Money, in this understanding, is not the goal. It is the tool. The goal is a life of genuine usefulness to yourself, to your family, to the strangers who will benefit from the excellent work you do in the years between now and the end. Barnum lived that goal imperfectly and magnificently for 80 years. He made mistakes, enormous ones by his own accounting. He lost fortunes and rebuilt them. He was humiliated and recovered. He was celebrated and criticized, and occasionally deceived. And through all of it, he maintained a fundamental cheerfulness. The cheerfulness of a man who found his vocation, worked at it with everything he had, and believed, with considerable justification, that the world was a more entertaining place for his having been in it. That is what the art of money getting is in the end. Not a set of tricks, not a shortcut, not a promise that the right attitude will conjure wealth from thin air. It is the patient, disciplined, integrity-rooted practice of adding value to the world and trusting that over time, the world will pay you back. It will. Closing reflection. What Barnum knew that most of us forget. In the final years of his life, P.T. Barnum was asked what he considered the secret of his success. He was in his 80s by then. The greatest show on earth was running without him needing to manage its daily affairs, and he had outlived most of his contemporaries and all of his early rivals. He thought about the question for a moment. Then he said something that surprised the interviewer, who had expected something theatrical and quotable. He said, "I found work that I loved. I worked at it as hard as I could, as honestly as I could, for as long as I could. The money followed. Not always, not without setbacks, not in a straight line. But it followed. That is the whole of it, really. Everything else in this book. The frugality, the avoidance of debt, the perseverance, the system, the advertising. All of it is in service of that single underlying truth. Find work that matters to you. Do it better than anyone else is willing to. Do it with your whole heart and your whole energy on sound ethical foundations, with the body of a person who takes care of their instrument. Do not consume your future before it arrives. Do not let discouragement masquerade as wisdom. Do not confuse the appearance of success with the substance of it. And when the money comes, use it well, not merely to make more money, though making more money is a worthy and serious discipline. Use it to build a life that you would choose again if you had the choice. That is what P.T. Barnum was trying to tell us 140 years ago, in the voice of a man who had seen the whole range of what wealth could do and what it could not. The art of money getting is at its heart the art of becoming the kind of person whose life produces value, and then refusing to let anything stop you from doing exactly that. The curtain is open. The show is yours. Bayadon, The Art of Money Getting, or Golden Rules for Making Money, by P.T. Barnum, 1880. Public domain. This adaptation expands and interprets the original text for a modern audiobook audience.